Great, we got the thumbs up. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Cecilia Aradaza, and I'm the Managing Director for Policy and Communications at Faster Cures. Faster Cures is a center of the Milken Institute, and our purpose, our goal is really to accelerate the process of medical research so that we can save time and save lives. And at the end of the day, it's really about efficiency and productivity. And when you think about what's slowing down the process, regardless of which disease or which sector you're in or which sector you're a part of, many times the process just gets in, many of the barriers are in the process, and that's really where we focus our attention on. So this conversation, it is an honor and a privilege certainly to moderate this panel of experts, not just experts, but really leaders who are shaping the future of health through smart and meaningful action around data. So this concept of big data, it's everywhere. If you can just cue slide 8, please. Everyone seems to be collecting it, analyzing it, making money from it, celebrating. Slide 8, please. Celebrating or even fearing its powers. Big data has allowed us to analyze a whole lot of different things. And the crunching of numbers, the analyzing it correctly, it promises to solve a whole lot of different problems. Virtually every problem, from the perils of dating to the challenges and adventures of parenting, and to predicting health outcomes for millions and millions of patients for generations to come. I think we're in the wrong panel set. That's okay, we will move right along. So now, we know that collecting data about patients when used in a productive and meaningful way might actually be the fuel that can accelerate research. And so today we focus on that aspect of big data, not on the cybersecurity conversation that we just heard over lunch. As important as those concerns might be, I think what we are here today to do is really look at some of the meaningful ways that big data can be used to, again, address the process issues that I was talking about earlier. So let me just kick off and say, everybody has an idea of what big data is or big data are, depending on where you're coming from. And I'm going to kick it off with just an opening question for our panelists here. Is it really all it's cracked up to be? How can we use data to accelerate some of the work that you're doing? And I'm going to start with Marty Cohn. And I'm going to go and introduce our panelists as they speak, so they've got illustrious bios in the program book. But I'm going to introduce them in ways that, as I've been doing the prep calls, it's been a fascinating journey. So Marty, I'm going to start with you. Marty started as a biomedical researcher, follow me here, and then he became an ER physician, and then decided it wasn't enough, so he went into hospital management. But managing hospitals is just not busy enough, so he decided to look into health policy and became a congressional health policy advisor. And then went into IBM Research, and was part of the IBM Watson group. And now that was just not challenging enough, and now has created Jointly Health, a startup company focusing on big data in health. Did I do that justice?
You got it, and that's why most people ask me how come I can't keep a job.
Well, look at all the trends there and analyze it. So Marty, let's start with you.
Thank you, and first thank you for the opportunity to attend this extraordinary conference. It's been just an amazing 2 days, and to join this august panel. Big data is kind of a tough thing to talk about, because you can't really define it, because it changes all the time and it's different in each person's mind. So when I got my first desktop computer back in the early 80s and had Lotus 123 on 5.5 inch floppy disks, when floppy disks actually were floppy. You were limited to 64 rows and 64 columns. Anything more than that was big data. Now your cell phone handles that with no problem at all. So the characteristics of big data and what's relevant to at least the work that I do, there are so many areas where it would have application, are perhaps described as 4 V's. One is volume, simply the amount of data not a real challenge for us. Technology catches up with that. Velocity, how fast the data comes at you, how fast it's expanding. But also technology kind of handles that. The third is variety, and there's one of the first challenges. In healthcare, there's so many different kinds of data. There's image data, there's laboratory data, other structured data, unstructured data, like in journal articles, streaming data, monitoring data that comes at you very fast. So the variety of data is a challenge, because if you want to make decisions in healthcare, you would like to be able to use all the data that's available to you, not just one area. I mean, genomics is very important, but it's not the only thing that determines health. We like to look at all the data. And the fourth, which I think is the most challenging, and the challenge of it is the fact that it has actually three different V's that may describe it to say the same thing. One is veracity, the other is value, and the third is variability, reflecting the fact that in all that data, a lot of it is inconsistent or maybe even wrong. And we have to deal with that. So IBM, for example, estimated in one of its global technology outlooks that by the year 2015, next year, 80% of the data we'll use will be inconsistent or in conflict. So the real challenge in using big data then is, how do you integrate the fact that some of the data you're going to use is wrong or inconsistent? New England Journal of Medicine says one thing, British Medical Journal says the other. So the area in which I work is under the general umbrella, I think, of decision support. Okay. And so their big data is important because we need to make better decisions. Don Berwick was the lead author on an article a couple of years ago in the Journal of the American Medical Association that, for example, estimated that depending on the assumptions you make, between 21% and 47% of what we spend on healthcare is for things of no value. The goal of healthcare is to improve healthcare outcomes and control costs simultaneously. So obviously one of the targets has to be reducing waste. If we're going to use that along with the other things, the goal of making healthcare more personalized, I'm making a decision that's specifically for you, not for a group of people that may bear some relationship to you. We're going to have to use information to make better decisions. So the more information we have, at least in theory, the more precise or personalized we can make a decision. So if I have enough information to learn a lot about you, and then I can look at all the array of healthcare information around me and pull out from that insights or inferences that'll help us together make a better decision for you, that's going to be a major contribution.
Absolutely.
Big data provides us that opportunity. It's the challenge because we have to use it all. But that's the opportunity. So that's something we haven't had before. When I started in medical school back in the 60s, the challenge was collecting information. Okay, you'd spend hours in the library. Now I go online and do a search and I get 103,122 hits in 0.12 seconds. The challenge, how do I use that? What's important? What's relevant in that? So that's the challenge and the opportunity of big data.
Fantastic. I want to punctuate that point with slide 2. I'm told that our PowerPoint's back on. You know, when you, the other one, actually the other one was correct. Let's go back to that one. So when you look at where data is actually coming from, it is a whole host of a variety of different things, from research and development to genetic markers. It is this one slide that it's the patient, it's the patient's community, it's the patient's lifestyle. All of that contribute to the big data that we are talking about at this time. So I'm going to switch over to Joel Dudley. So Joel comes here from the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. He's the director of biomedical informatics, and I want to touch on this topic of new training opportunities and new disciplines focused on just big data. And so, Matt, what's really interesting at Mount Sinai is this is where a lot of this conversation about patient data being aggregated to inform decisions, it's happening where you are. And I believe there's been a $250 million investment, you know, a couple million there. Here.
Yeah.
It's real money soon.
Yeah.
Focused on big data in genomics and informatics. So if you can tell us a little bit about that, and really, again, is big data all it's cracked up to be?
Yeah, so I'll comment first on that. Big data is it all that is cracked up to be. I think it's really just following the hype cycle. You see lots of technologies follow, right? So I think you can look at genomics, right? The genomics hype cycle followed the same thing, where you see the possibilities of the technology, and then there's a small group of people that really can see it, and you can see in 10 years where the technology is going to go, right? So there's a small group of folks like myself are like, oh my God, this is going to change everything. You know, we're going to be able to, you know, target drugs to tumors and do all these things, and people are saying that 10 years ago. Well, folks like Foundation Medicine and other companies are just got their test approved within the last couple of years, right? So that hype cycle where people can see the future and see that vision of where things are going and are getting really excited about it, but then the reality sets in that we still have to work a lot of things out. I think that's largely true with a lot of aspects of big data. Today, there's a lot of people that can say, oh my God, most of my healthcare is going to be done at CVS. There's going to be a dock in a box. I'm going to have mobile apps with my wireless devices talking to my Apple phone, and there's going to be these analytics running on the back end, and I won't have to go to the doctor unless I'm really sick, and they're going to be telling me day to day what I can do to have an optimal, healthy life. So that you can see that it's going to happen, but there's a lot of things we have to do to get from point A to point B to realize that vision. But one of my favorite quotes is that the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed. So all the pieces, and I'm on 4 hours of sleep on New York Times, so I'm totally forgetting the author. Gibson is a science fiction author. So, all the pieces for that, what I just talked about in terms of that, most of your health being predictive and happening at your local CVS or an Uber car that you call up on your phone and the dock in the box drives to your house. That's all. The technology exists. We got to put it together and validate it clinically and things like that. What's happening at Mount Sinai is interesting because if you're a data-oriented person like myself, and I was lucky enough to be trained in molecular biology, medicine, and computer science to see both sides of the equation, but you come in and what you see in the hospitals is a tremendous amount of data exhaust being generated. So I was mentioning to someone over lunch that all the data and everything that comes off the monitors, a lot of places will just delete after 3 months. The heart monitors, the heart rate monitors, they're capturing the data, but they're never looking at it. And it's insane to me. You want to pull your head out because what we want to build is a learning healthcare system, right? So we see at Mount Sinai Health System now 4 million patients a year, right? So when you come in as a new patient at Mount Sinai today, or other hospitals today, the doctor has some institutional knowledge in their head of patients maybe that are somewhat like you. They've seen you're a male, you're 45, and they will treat you based on that experience. But what we want to build is a learning healthcare system where it says, okay, we're going to get a basic set of blood tests done on you, maybe do some genomics, and then we're going to place you in that universe of every other patient we've ever seen that's ever walked into our health system based on all that information we know. Think of it like a topographic map of all the patients we've ever seen, and that neighborhood compared to all the other patients that we've ever seen, that's going to sort of dictate what maybe we'll do next. 90% of people that were in that GPS coordinate of health of the Mount Sinai Health System, 90% took statins, this happened. 10% this happened. So a lot of these medical centers are sitting on massive, massive amounts of data and never looking at it, other than doing financial reporting and things like that. So what we're doing now is trying to relook at all this data with sort of a big data perspective, and one of those perspectives is being sort of unbiased in a way and realizing that everything we probably know is wrong, and we need to relook at everything that we assumed is the truth. One great example of that is diseases. So we have these ideas that diseases fall into these discrete buckets. You have type 2 diabetic patients, they go see endocrinologists. You have cancer patients, they go see oncologists, et cetera. But when you look at the molecular data, and when you look at the hospital data, the blood lab test data, that's a preposterous idea. The data shows you that disease is a massive continuum, right? And we artificially cookie cutter out these little groups and call them by ICD-9 codes, and I understand there's billing and things associated with that, this disease, that disease. But the data shows you that the humans just exist on a huge continuous map of health states, and we arbitrarily slice out these things and group these into diseases. So that's one aspect where we're trying to redefine disease with data. And another quick anecdote I'll end with, even doing mundane things like seemingly mundane, looking at patient satisfaction reports. So a lot of the healthcare laws are going to now tie reimbursement to things like patient satisfaction surveys. One project I have going on at Mount Sinai right now is I took all the historical patient satisfaction surveys and I tied it to all the lab data, the blood test data. Well, guess what? Blood levels of certain things will predict how you're going to rate the hospital, right? So we think these things are objective, that, if they got good care, they're going to rate the hospital well. No, actually, if your potassium's low because you got this drug while you're in the hospital, you might give a bad score no matter what happened. So again, throwing out our assumptions and letting the data tell us what the truth is.
Can I use that as an excuse the next time I get a bad evaluation on the hospital?
Yeah, exactly.
See, metrics, it's all relative, right? Yeah. So thank you for that. And we're going to go back and learn more about a lot of what you're doing. And so I'm going to switch over and introduce Magali Haas. Magali is founder and CEO of Orion Bionetworks. She also served as Chief Science and Technology Officer at One Mind for Research. It's a nonprofit really focused on the development and prevention of brain disorders. Previously, she was a pharmaceutical executive, mostly at J&J, and I was really intrigued by the description of intrapreneur And we need more intrapreneurs as well as entrepreneurs there across the board, not just at J&J, but certainly, having that entrepreneurial spirit as you pursue medical research and find answers to all these really complex questions. I want to tee up slide number 3, please. The one with the body that was showed earlier. Perfect. So it goes back to the data that we were talking about, the big data we were talking about earlier, external data. Now, if you look at just the patient and just the volume of data within each patient and what that means, I think it's a remarkable task to really figure it out so that it's not just data. Data for data's sake is really meaningless. It's how you understand it, how you analyze it, and then how you apply it. So Magali, if you can share some of your research and some of the focus of Orion Bionetworks, that'd be terrific.
Sure. As you outline here, the issue isn't just big data, but it's also the right data, collecting the right data from patients that will help us understand the causes of their disease. So we founded Orion Bionetworks to start to build predictive models of brain disorders. To help you understand what that means is think about weather prediction and what we can do today to predict when a hurricane is going to strike our shores. We've been able to do that kind of predictive modeling because we have high performance computing available to us, and we have the right data collection at the local and at the national and international level. And it takes all kinds of different types of data, but you have to have the right data to build those models. We're trying to do the same thing for brain disorders, and we think this is critically important because brain disorders represent the single largest tsunami that's going to hit our shores in terms of socioeconomic crisis. Over 2 billion people are affected by brain disorders today, and it costs us over $2 trillion between the United States and the US alone to treat these people with these conditions. And if you think about that and then look around the room, 1 in 5 of us will be affected by a brain disorder in our lifetime. And how many of us can say that there are definitive diagnostics or treatments or cures for these disorders? The answer is there are almost none. None. So we've heard at this conference 7,000 diseases, 10% of those are brain disorders. So why aren't we making more progress against these disorders? It's fundamentally we don't understand the mechanisms of brain disease. And we don't have the right kind of data collected from patients at the scale, so we need to do large-scale observational studies and then build predictive models of that data to do this weather prediction. So Orion Bionetworks is an alliance of partners that each contributes either data or know-how, capabilities, computational capabilities, and we build predictive models. And we've just started last year, but we built our first models for multiple sclerosis, and we're already finding new biology.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And we'll certainly go back to you to kind of continue to connect the dots about we're talking about big data, but certainly it's massive data. And it's, again, trying to tease out of all this information that's at our fingertips right now, how do we make it meaningful? So I'm going to turn over to Risa Sack of GE Healthy Imagination. So Risa is General Manager of Incubations. Risa has been involved in building some of the most innovative products and companies emerging in healthcare. She came to GE from Kleiner Perkins and certainly can listen to this conversation and give us a reality check of exactly what's going to stick on the market, what will consumers actually respond to, and where are we going next with this conversation about big data in healthcare?
Yeah, so what I do is I invest in companies, I start new companies, and I also develop new business strategies for GE. An area areas we're focused on right now are employer health or employer benefits space, digital health, and big data. And you can argue, are big data and digital health the same thing, and what is digital health? So we focus a lot on this area. I think the real, and looking at lots of startup companies, one of the interesting things is this is an area that people are really excited about. There's been a lot of money poured into it, particularly in the last, I'd say, year. I read something that's on the order of 800 million can be invested in big data, digital health, healthcare IT. And the interesting thing is we really have to figure out what problems are we trying to solve. We see a lot of startups, and then you go and you talk to the physicians, you say, does this really help you, or is this a problem? And I think that's the clear focus, is understanding and validate the problems that the companies are trying to solve. Areas that we're particularly interested in are, and from the data perspective, I would say clinical decision support. We touched on that a bit earlier, because there is so much data existing in the system, particularly in the EMRs, and it's not well used or well mined. We've looked at NLP, natural language processing, and that type of thing, and we think there's a lot of value in, for example, the hospital system and in the EMRs. It just needs to be pulled out and displayed in a manner that a physician can look at it quickly and really help them make a decision about the patient sitting in front of them, instead of trying to kind of look through a bunch of different screens on Epic, which is often what happens now. The other component that we've seen, which is really interesting, is population health. It's another term that's broadly used. And what I've seen that's particularly interesting to me is really trying to understand the patient as a person. So you have a person who has an illness, but do you know, are they high or low income? Because that can affect whether or not you should give them a coupon so they take their medication, and think about the things of what's that person more as an individual, and that will help you understand the decisions they're going to make about their health care. And then if you're a physician talking to that patient, you can offer them incentives or things that will really help them better take care of themselves. The third point that we think about a lot is the connectivity of data, because one of the challenges is that the data isn't well connected even within the hospital, in terms of, it was mentioned that the data after 3 months is just not even utilized, but a lot of it isn't even well connected within the hospital. And as GE being we have as very focused on the hospital and a lot of equipment in the hospital, trying to figure out how do you make all those connections and make it really valuable. And I think it was touched on earlier, another important area is data outside the hospital. Can you integrate that? Now people wear Fitbits and Nike Fuel Bands and such. And is there a way that you can take that data and bring it to the physician in the way that they want to use it? Because right now, we've seen a lot of devices like arrhythmia monitors, these Fitbits, et cetera. And there's no good way to get the data to the medical community in a way they can use it when the patient's there at the right time. And so that's an area that's of interest, because can you put all this data together in a way that is usable? And a lot of it's really the usability of the data and getting the right data, the data when the physician can use it, and in a way that makes sense from how they think about patients and workflow. It's really interesting. As we've been thinking about this, we stepped back and we looked at other industries. We looked at, for example, like Google and Apple. Google in particular is amazing about doing what we call digital hooks. They put information. They say, okay, oh Risa, you can use email. Now I'll manage your calendar for you, and they do and put all your stuff on our drive. So they're collecting all this information about me. And then now it really became apparent when they acquired Nest. I went, oh my God, now they're going to know when I'm in and out of my house, right? And so what Google was amazing at doing was kind of getting me to give them information, because it made my life easier, and that information then they could then use to figure out what I was going to do. But that's the interesting thing about healthcare. We have a lot of information, and we don't collect it in a good way. We don't make it usable. There's been attempts like Google had a health effort to try and get patients to manage their own information and collect it. I actually think that there's going to be another wave of that, and that people are going to be much more interested in that, because another thing we haven't talked about, some of the macroeconomic trends, but we think a lot about, is the focus of healthcare is becoming more consumer directed because of the move to shift the cost of the healthcare to the patient. And so a lot of people are on high deductible health plans. Well, it matters whether or not that's $100 out of pocket or it's $20, and I'm really going to care about that. Whereas I think before, people were not as incentivized. So there's some really interesting macroeconomic trends. And just one more comment with regards to a self-insured employer. If you think about it, who's paying? The self-insured employer are, and there's a lot of them now. Even some of the smaller companies, and GE is one of the biggest. They're actually they're paying for the healthcare. Like United or whoever is really more of an administrator, because we at GE pay for it. as a business. And so the employers are now incentivized again to really figure out and really get information about their employees to offer them the best benefits, et cetera, that meet their needs. So it's a very interesting time with a lot of changes in the healthcare system, and that combined with the fact that we are now so used to having data and information at our fingertips as a consumer.
Absolutely. And you're talking about a systemic shift here, and we're living it day to day. So Andy, I'm going to turn to you. I want to introduce Andy von Eschenbach. He's currently president of Samaritan Health Initiatives, Inc. Andy has, again, check the bios definitely in your program book, because the illustrious careers of our panelists are pretty phenomenal. But Andy was former commissioner of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration and former director of the National Cancer Institute. So I'm going to turn to you, Andy, to look at all of these conversations all these comments, and see from a systemic level, how is big data actually changing healthcare and health cure systems as we know it?
Well, that's a great question, Cecilia. And first of all, let me thank you for the opportunity and privilege to be on a panel with such distinguished people. I came here so I could learn something. But the view I've taken of this is to really step back and ask the question, what's the utility of big data, and what's our goal? And so for me, especially as a clinician, investigator, and an oncologist, the goal is to create solutions for the complex diseases that are afflicting us. And the utility, in my opinion, of big data is that it gives us the capability of dealing with the complexity of those disease processes and the complexity of the people who are afflicted with them. So from that perspective, I think it's kind of interesting to look at it a bit historically. If you go back 100 years ago, data was relatively simple. Clinicians made observations, be they Halsted or Osler, recorded those observations and defined a body of knowledge we called medicine. Things got a little bit more complicated as the century went along, and we began to then realize we couldn't manage that in the clinical arena. So we took it into a laboratory and we started to try to model it, and we put mechanisms in place like trial designs and things of that sort, because the data was overpowering us and we needed new tools. But what we've learned along the way as we've gotten greater insights into the complexity of diseases like cancer and Alzheimer's and all the rest, and an appreciation of the complexity of the people with them from the genetic, molecular, cellular level, that in itself is no longer of any usefulness or utility. So what's next? And the advantage I see of big data is the fact that we now, for the first time, can look holistically in human beings of the disease processes and the patient with those disease processes, and begin to pack all those parts and pieces of that and begin to do an assembly process and manage the complexity of it. So we then create a value proposition. And the value proposition is we acquire the data, we aggregate it, we analyze it, and then we act. So it's data to information to knowledge. And with knowledge, with these new tools, with these new opportunities, we now can transform the whole paradigm of medicine and of healthcare. We now are able to manage the complexity of these diseases because we can understand them by virtue of the fact that we can manage the data and the information. So I have great hope, and I think it requires a great commitment to the struggle to find the right tools, to clarify what the right data is, and to really then be able to do this systematically.
Absolutely, and this systematic change and this call for being able to understand the data that's in front of us. You know, when you think about Facebook and you think about how people are opening up their lives and sharing it in real time, and how all of that, that's big data at its finest there. It's nothing as, it's complex, but nothing as complex as the data we're talking about in the healthcare space. But how quickly the industry was able to really take the data in front of them and churn it into advertising campaigns that's so tailored. And you almost see it in real time, and you almost don't realize that it's happening until you start getting this, you know, the pop-up ads that actually tailor to you, and it's a little scary sometimes. But that kind of uptake is happening in the technology world. It's happening in a lot of other sectors. But here, it seems like there are a lot of pockets of innovation. How do we accelerate the uptake from a variety of different points? And I want to open it up to our panel here and really get your perspectives on this. What do we need? What are some of the tools? What are some of the policies? What are some of the investments needed to really kind of propel this forward, so we're not talking about big data as if it's kind of the next frontier, but as a thing that we're using in something that is already supporting decision making as it happens?
Well, I think the principal test is you have to be doing something useful that has value. Information technology in healthcare has at best a checkered history. You know, back in the 70s, you know, when the electronic health record was first being foisted upon the healthcare environment, you know, it was advertised as the panacea. It was going to solve all our information problems. You wouldn't lose anything. Everything would be perfect. It has not turned out that way. And, you know, that's left a bad taste. And so it's, you know, for example, with electronic health records, it's very hard to find a physician who says, boy, I love my electronic health record. It has made my life for me. More it's griping, because it doesn't do, in large part, what clinicians needed to get their job done. So the model of the 60s and 70s in technologies, you develop the technology first and then find a way to force somebody to use it, is gone. So you have to address a real world problem, and you have to do it in such a way that makes somebody say, yes, this actually makes a difference for me. So you have to pick a problem and a problem that you can measure, so you can measure the outcome, and do it in such a way that it has value. So for example, you know, what we're doing with Jointly Health is in the area of chronic disease.
Okay.
It's an important area both clinically and economically. 75% more or less of the healthcare spend right now is on patients with chronic diseases.
Right.
So it's, you know, it's both a real clinical, social, and financial burden. And, you know, there's a lot of incentive right now in encouraging, you know, people to manage chronic care better, and in particular to, you know, the idea of avoidable admissions. You know, keep people out of the hospital because once they get admitted to the hospital, it's very expensive and all sorts of other complications. So we work in the area of using big data analytics, both longitudinal information and data we collect from home monitoring, to rate patients, you know, kind of risk categorize patients and identify patients, ideally days in advance, who would deteriorate if you don't do something to change their outcome. And help then these integrated delivery networks, managed care plans and so on, keep their patients healthier and out of the hospital and reduce the cost of healthcare and improve health. So that works because it addresses real world issues. And the organizations with which we deal see that value.
Exactly. And so, you know, theoretically, it makes complete sense. It's almost counterproductive to even, you know, it's counterproductive sometimes to really think about all of the different processes that need to be in place for this to actually work, because it's so obvious to us. So I'm going to jump over to you, Joel, because you're actually, what's the uptake like for physicians at Mount Sinai, for researchers? You know, you're building this system that allows all of this to happen, the tools that Marty just mentioned. You know, are people excited about it? Is there some pushback? You're kind of changing a system.
No, they're super excited, because for the majority of diseases these doctors are treating, they're just getting beat down because they can't cure the disease, right? We don't have cures for hardly any diseases, really, right? I mean, so if you look at something like inflammatory bowel disease, which the best drug is, maybe you could argue, an anti-TNF alpha, an immune modulator, works on 35% of the patients only. It's a very expensive drug. And all the studies, the genetic studies, are showing that there are now 200 or 300 genes associated with this disease, right? So now we're finding that this disease is just, so not only can't they treat the patients that they have, effectively or well. Now they're finding that every day that the disease is 10 times more complex than they could have ever imagined. And are we going to find one drug target, to cure that one disease with 300 genes? And I think one problem with all the health data we have is it's mostly on sick people, and that we're learning from sick people. I think it's a huge problem. We do not know what a normal person looks like. We absolutely do not know what a normal human person looks like at all. There's no good model. We don't know. We don't know what normal
Define
is.
normal.
Heterogeneity.
Don't know. It's heterogeneity. We don't know. So you come in, you get your blood test, you get your T lymphocyte counts or something like that. The high probability you're going to fall within the standard normal range of these standard normal range tests. But person A might have a very tightly controlled T lymphocyte count. Person B might have very crazy. We don't know glucose, insulin resistance. We don't know what a normal person looks like at all. And we don't understand the dynamics, the day-to-day dynamics of a normal person. So I think, one thing I'm very interested in at Mount Sinai, and we have a project underway to get this going, is to figure out what is the model, the multi-scale model of a normal, average human being. And in terms of understanding from the DNA level through the immune system, through metabolites, through brain changes on minute-by-minute basis, how is that changing? We just don't know. We have these fleeting snapshots of when people come to the doctor, or only when they're really sick. So we don't know. We only see the end stage of that trajectory. We're looking at the blood spatter on the wall and trying to figure out, the crime scene.
Right. So going back to the question that I initially posed too, Risa, I want to turn to you and say, what's kind of holding us back right now? What could potentially propel us forward? The investments, or is the investment community, are investors ready for this to really kind of
So one of the really
double down?
interesting things about it, and as I mentioned, there's a lot of money going into this space, but the business models are challenging from the perspective of who's going to pay. And I think depending on where you are, if it's a product that's hospital-centric, hopefully the hospital pays. But hospitals and just healthcare in general has not really valued health IT, healthcare information. It's a hard, long sales cycle. We mentioned the checkered history here. And so it's just not, it's actually, it's a much smaller proportion of the budget than a lot of other businesses. So I think that's the challenge, is selling in the hospital. One of the other really interesting challenges of healthcare just in general is, and we're moving toward consumer-directed healthcare, but in most cases, the payer, the patient is not necessarily the one paying, the insurance company is. And so, we're going to hire deductibles, yeah, but ultimately the insurance company is making the decision about what they'll pay for or not. And one of the things that the insurance companies have never really wanted to pay for is wellness. And so the idea that I collect all this information and that I'm well, and that and you maybe pay for different monitors and things like that, so that I'm well. They want to pay to take care of the sick people, and so as a result, then there's really a hesitance, for a lot of the monitoring technology. One of the interesting things, and this is probably over a year now, there's a company called WellDoc that's now being reimbursed, and what they do is they allow a diabetic to kind of enter information about their day, blood sugar level, and all that stuff on a handheld device, and it's reimbursed by some of the major insurers. But one of the biggest challenges is just getting some of the new technology paid. So I was just reading, for example, whether or not we'll pay for a televisit with a physician or not. That's still not reimbursed in a lot of cases, where it would actually be, as someone was telling me a story the other day, moved to a new town, didn't have a doctor, had some basic medication they needed refilled. I can't remember what it was, but and basically said, okay, they paid for a televisit, like $50, and talked to the doctor through all the history of symptoms, and he renewed this guy's prescription. So I think the concept of televisits and using technology to make healthcare more efficient is great, but really our insurers aren't set up to pay for it. And so for me, having a way that, and this has always been a challenge with the insurance industry, because I've spent a lot of my time developing diagnostics and drugs. What do they pay for, right? And so having really kind of driving that forward in terms of standards and more experiments in that area, I think would be really helpful, because if you know that you can get paid for something to solve a problem, companies can develop a solution.
It goes back to the conversation about value and coverage.
Right.
What kind of evidence? Yeah, I'm going to actually jump back to Marty really quick here, because you're developing these products as we're talking, like the tools. are you also having conversations about reimbursement structures? Are you having that conversation as you're creating the mechanisms?
Well, that's an important part of the role because somebody has to pay for it. The area in which we work sort of incorporates that because we work with these managed care plans. And the accountable care-like organization model, where an organization agrees to take responsibility for the health care for a group of patients for a fixed amount of money, and guarantees economic effectiveness and improved clinical outcomes. So in those organizations, and there are models from the Kaiser and Geisinger that have been doing this for a while, they're both payer and provider. So they have aligned incentives. So like if you have a hospital that exists in isolation, an admission is revenue.
Right.
If you're an integrated network, an admission is a cost.
Exactly.
So the organizations we deal with are in that model. So for them, if they keep their patients healthier and out of the hospital, it's a win-win.
It's all about the incentives.
That's right. And without the right incentives, so for instance, if I'm a cardiologist and I do caths, I'm an invasive cardiologist, and you come up to me and say, listen, we have this great tool that helps you make a better decision, and you'll have to do 30% fewer caths. And I say, but you say that's a waste, but that's 30% of my income. I'm not going to be all that interested unless the incentive changes so that I now have an incentive to actually improve quality, not just do procedures. The area in which we work is supported that way.
And so, Andy, I know you wanted to chime in there too, but like on the incentive structure, how do we reshape the way we're actually paying for a lot of these things? Because the reality is big data can actually be very, very efficient and cost effective, but it doesn't align with the current structures that we have.
Well, simply stated, the value proposition comes in when I can do something as a result of that data. When I go from just data to the point where I have knowledge, I know what this patient's condition is, I know what to do because I've derived that from the data, then that's a value to the patient, it's a value proposition for the payer, et cetera. But you asked a more fundamental question, which is, what's getting in the way, and clearly reimbursement will be an issue, but I don't think that's the core problem. I used to think when I started at NCI, the Cancer Biomedical Informatics Grid, that the reason that didn't really come along was we didn't quite have the technology yet. That's not the case anymore. The technologies are there. I think we're even far along with regard to the analytics. The biggest barrier I see right now is culture. And I'll speak specifically to my experience at the FDA and the regulatory framework. We have had a model that's worked exceedingly well for us of acquiring data in phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 clinical trials so that we could know enough about the performance of a drug in a population to make a regulatory decision. Big data gives us the opportunity now, and we know that that's not been completely adequate. Big data gives us the opportunity now to really change the scale and scope of that, and to be able to think in terms of a phase 4, which could even eliminate the need for a phase 3 in many cases, not perhaps all, and use population at large in real world situations where we have the scale of the number of people and the scope of the number of variables that we want to look at, and we can know everything we'd want to know with confidence around the performance of a drug. So how do you make the cultural shift to give up what's been the tried and proven and embrace something that we're going to have to work through?
Right, so what you're also saying here is that for so long we've had such a linear process of really taking an idea and moving it to market, and now you got to put it in context. So let me linger on that for a minute. Like, who's in charge? So if you're going to collect all this big data, who's in charge of sifting all of that so that it then can influence some of the regulatory decision making? And if we're going to turn this on its head, like, where do we start?
Well, I mean, the question really begins with who owns the data, and I've always believed that the patient owns the data, but that's really an irrelevant question. The real question is who possesses the data. And so I think it's where the data repository is, or where the access to that data is. So if we can get our handle on that, then the rest of it flows, because we know who's in control. Possession is 9/10 of the
So-
law here.
Right. So
And-
who should possess the data? If the patients own it, are we saying somebody else possesses it?
Yes.
And who would that entity be?
It will vary. It could be the FDA if this is data relevant to a regulatory decision. It could be the healthcare provider as it relates to the delivery of care. It could be the healthcare payer or provider who's trying to manage a healthy population.
And so it's who's using the data, the patient. I'm
use-
going to jump to Magali here, because you're at the core of patient data. That's your business model. And so what are your perspectives on these comments so far? Because you're on the other end of the pipeline, if you will, but it could also be that it's a full continuum in that all the care information, all the big data we're collecting from the patient outcomes end could fuel right back to the Cure enterprise.
Right, exactly. I think that what we have an opportunity to do now is to basically close the loop. And what that doesn't happen now. So you can think of the loop as being everything from the basic science to then the drug development process out to clinical setting, collecting information about how impactful our therapeutics are, and then coming right back to and closing the loop and driving that discovery basic science cycle again. But right now, we don't have a platform for sharing knowledge and understanding about these disorders. We don't know what normal looks like. We don't know what even disease projections look like, and we don't have a mechanism for data sharing across organizations. So I don't think any one organization owns the data per se. Everyone is going to analyze it for different purposes. But if we could at least all adopt common standards of how we refer to data and have the ability to all look at the data and think about a much more open system of understanding, then we can all draw from the data the insights that we need to do what we need to do in our component of that pipeline.
I think you've got a couple of other challenges too. I agree philosophically with Andy that the patient owns the data. That's not the real world yet. And so a lot of healthcare organizations, I think they take the approach that knowledge is power, and I'm not going to diminish my power by giving you any of my knowledge. And it's very hard to get that. But you have a couple of other steps. So let's assume we had all the data and we had effective decision support and we put it out there. Research over the years is physicians, clinicians are not the people that are best at using decision support, even when good guidelines exist.
Culture, exactly.
The compliance with these guidelines is typically at 30-40%. So it's a change in the culture of adopting and using and embracing these guidelines and decision support to help make better decisions. And then we also have, I don't want to misquote it, so we also have some political and social challenges. Give me just one moment here. I'm sorry, I'm losing control of my technology. So I want to quote this because I don't want to misrepresent. There was a bill submitted by a senator to a state legislature a year ago, January, that prohibits performing any analytic or statistical processing with regard to any medical records from multiple patients for purposes of medical diagnosis or treatment, including population health management. This was submitted to the state legislature.
Which state?
Anybody here from Virginia?
Well,
Okay.
right here.
Fortunately, it was voted down in committee, never made it to the floor. But it was voted down by a vote of 13-2, which meant 2 state senators voted for that bill.
Believed in that.
Yeah. To me,
That's
that means legislating ignorance. It's kind of scary. So we have, even if we had all the technology, I don't think technology is the limiting factor here. I think it's all this around.
So let me switch up a little bit here. When you think about, let's go micro for a minute to healthcare delivery. So in the US alone, it is estimated that up to 20% of diagnoses are either incorrect or incomplete. And we've learned to just accept that as that's the status quo, and it's okay. In addition, there are an estimated 1.5 million errors in the way medications are prescribed, delivered, and taken in the US every year. So when we look at the errors in the delivery of care, that's really where the rubber hits the road. Because I think when it comes to consumer uptake, once it starts changing or impacting the way you absorb the information, the way you actually interact with the healthcare system, then you've got people who are more likely going to be much more engaged in the process. What role does big data play in that context? Any takers? Risa, do you want to
Reese's.
start this?
Well, big data can. I mean, I think a lot of the decision support tools, a lot of the workflow tools are designed to try and eliminate those some of those errors and some of the problems that we see with the healthcare system, which in either spending money on things that don't work or errors that result from somebody trying to manage too many patients. So I think there's a lot of there's definitely a lot of opportunity there in that particular area from an investing perspective.
Because I think part of it too, just to chime in here, it's when you want to get a kind of a sea change in attitude, which could very well impact the cultural barriers that we had talked about. You want to, I think a lot of the big data conversations really about infrastructure and creating a framework for a system so that it gets stronger and becomes much more efficient, right?
Well, I think a lot of these tools become much more important in an ACO environment because you really care. I mean, that's the thing that we maybe should start the conversation with, is the move from fee for service to pay for value, whatever you want to call it. And you probably know better that it's still, in terms of ACOs or IDNs or the closed systems, it's still pretty small percentage. Even though we talk about it a lot, it's less than 10% or so.
But it's increasing quite rapidly.
Yeah, it is increasing rapidly, and I've seen varying numbers about that. But that will drive the uptake of a lot of these different tools because they're already penalizing for various different things. But there's going to be, because you get paid X amount to take care of this patient. You screw up, they get a hospital-acquired infection, is actually pretty frequent right now. A friend of mine went in to have a baby, a C-section, and almost went into septic shock afterwards because she got an infection in the hospital. I mean, that patient just cost them a hell of a lot more money than they would have normally. And so in an environment where you got $10,000 and whoops, cost you $100,000 because so people really care about that.
But there are other emerging opportunities in this space, and I'm not an expert on all of them, but things I'm aware of. I mean, pharmacy benefits managers, managers of large healthcare systems are using big data to monitor compliance. It's not a matter of was the drug prescribed. They know, they can tell, and they have, and the data gives them the infrastructure in which they can do the analytics and pick up those trends and recognize that then they can positively intervene and correct that. And they've gotten very sophisticated about it. It's a little bit like American Express. I mean, they used to call you very frequently early on to be sure it was you using the card. They don't do that very much anymore because big data's
cut it off.
They know the context
Yeah,
in
they
which
know.
you're using that
true.
card.
That's right.
And if the context matches up, they
Right,
figure
they
it's
know
you.
that I travel to New York all the time and use my
Right.
card, but hey, if I'm in Istanbul, that's kind of weird. Reese's not usually in Istanbul.
Right. So those are the kinds of opportunities that when
Yeah.
you're managing these systems now are coming into play, and they can be preemptive.
And I want to bring in the audience a little bit here because the big data conversation has so many different angles to it, and we've got a really terrific audience. I think we have time for a couple of questions. So, here's one up front.
Yeah, I'm Harlan Weissman, and among other things, I'm Harlan Weissman, and among other things, I guess two relevant things. One is I'm on the Board of Governors of PCORI, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute. We just started something, a patient-centered research network that we call PCORNet. And so we're thinking about these things all the time, and they're daunting, some of them, when you really get down to it. You raised a lot of the issues, but one of the things in talking that I think is getting confused a little bit, at least in my mind, is what's the data going to be used for? I mean, we have Joel talking about, in a sense, using it for hypothesis seeking and confirming the typical laboratory and exploratory clinical type of setting. Martin, you seem to be talking about aiding clinical decision making. And the reason I say they're different is what, Andy, you were talking about, the FDA system, is very akin to what Joel's talking about. You have a hypothesis and you test it. But that is not the way we live our lives, and it's also not the way medicine is, or clinical care is really given. We use judgment based on our experience, and we learn as we go. And I think Joel actually talked about a learning environment. It's what people, I don't want to get overly complex, but it's what people call a Bayesian approach, where you have a certain prior probability, and then you observe something, you observe it enough, you think it might be true. For me, and for, I think, Corey, the hope for some of this, and I think looking for mechanisms and cures is really admirable, and I want you to do it. But for taking care of people, Corey has the 4 questions, which are, what do you need at the point of care? You don't care really about mechanisms. Randomized clinical trials are totally unhelpful, even if they're unambiguous. You want to know about yourself. So that's the question of what are we? Could we get clarity about? I think there's a real difference in this, and I'm wondering between the empirical approach.
I think we agree. I think there's a bunch of different problems people are trying to solve, and everybody uses big data as a buzzword, and it can be trying to get new clinical inferences, it can be decision support, it can be understanding the population you're treating, and how can we break it down to smaller populations. So I think there are a lot of different questions you can answer,
And I would
just
like
name
to
relevant.
comment quick. By the way, Mount Sinai is part of PCORnet, so it's an awesome program.
We love
So, but I want to. What we're trying to build though at Mount Sinai is this sort of unified data set on our patient population. We want the social, we want the emotional, the environmental, we want the genetic, we want that, and we use Bayesian network inference, actually we use Bayesian systems to do this. So, and we can use that same modeling to discover drugs or inform clinical decision
Slide
support.
2,
It's
please.
not like we have to build a separate
fungible.
data set. We just ask different questions of this same integrated
Different lens,
system.
right.
Yeah.
And I think at the end of the day, too, there's so many different uses of it, and that's what I think what we're talking about, that data for data's sake and is really not helpful. It's how we use it. And although we're using it in so many different shapes and sizes, it's still data about a person. And I think, how we...
It may not, what a patient wants, what matters to a patient may not be what matters to him.
Absolutely.
Right.
But we can
But we
integrate
can-
that
yeah.
information into
Yeah.
this type
Yeah.
of system, and that's
Yeah.
actually one of the things that
Right.
we're trying to do is utilize
That's it.
patient-powered networks to collect data from the individuals to understand what they perceive as their disorder, what's important, what are the endpoints that matter, and to get better phenomenology of their disease, which we then can import into this Bayesian network to understand how that fits back with the molecular basis of the disorder and the prognosis and all of it. So we do a better job diagnosing patients based on their own criteria. So it's absolutely all integratable.
We can talk after this session because I think I'm going to interrupt.
Absolutely.
But with big data, there's another conceptual approach that in decision support or in any analytics that I think would be worth thinking about. It's a different idea from the null hypothesis approach that you were
Yes.
talking about.
Great. Karen.
So thanks to the panel for all this. In our work in research, and Magali knows this very well, one of our key issues is consent. So we haven't talked at all about HIPAA, consent, and the de-identification of data. So what are your thoughts? How can we get people to trust us that we're going to use this data for good purposes and not for Big Brother and evil?
Joel, I want you to take that question.
Because
You're in a
you have
healthcare.
to consent a lot of people. I mean, I'm
Right.
going to talk to Eric about that at
Yes.
some point. and
So
and
I
the
think
level of
we're
information.
pushing pretty hard on this in this front at Mount Sinai. So we're actually working with our IRB to change our default consent. We're sort of adopting aspects of this portable legal consent. It's by John Wilbanks to have patients own the data by default, and then what we're finding, it's almost like Risa said about the Google Calendar and all that kind of thing. The patients are just overzealous to give us all their data back and more. Because I think obviously they see us as a trusted partner, but if they trust us and they see value in giving us the data, they will give us more than we could ever want. So I think we hope to be setting a trend that way, that the patients are actually willing to give fairly broad consents, to research use of the data. I'm not running out of time, but we have a biobank where we have EMR data and genetic data on 30,000 of our patients. And 30,000 of those people consented to broad reuse of that data for any disease, any question we want. So.
I have one question from Mary over here.
I was just going to comment. My name's Mary Dwight, and I'm with the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation. And I think one of the things the foundation is known for is its data, and the rich, robust, and long-standing patient registry, which I would echo your point. Our patients are ecstatic to give it. Our clinicians are ecstatic to load it. It's part of it is the core component of becoming an accredited cystic fibrosis care center, is that you must enter the data. And it's been an invaluable tool. It's got us drug approval in 3 months for our most recent drug, Kalydeco, because we could see what a difference it made because of the longstanding data. And the beauty of that is that it hasn't, we haven't tapped into it at all the things that we know it can do. And a lot of the conversations you guys were having, I think, really are some of our thinking too about how do we merge this in the clinical experience beyond what the regulatory requirements are. But I would say there is one area that our patients are reluctant and have a sense of big brother. And this, again, remember, is a culture of sharing information, and that's adherence. And that is where they feel the finger wag and the scolding. And I would just I would love to know if you guys are thinking that too, because they're,
just a quick comment.
you know, to me, it's one of our final frontiers.
I want to get feedback on that from the panel.
Yeah, I'll jump in real quickly. It's really interesting because we see a lot of startups now, as Andy says, the PBMs know what drug is prescribed, but they don't know what you're taking. So there's a lot of people trying to address the issue of, are you taking your meds? Let me remind you to take your meds. I think, yeah, I could see that as being a challenge. I think we're going to go in that direction because of the cost, right? Someone who doesn't take their medication ends up in the ER more times than someone who does, right? So, but I think it's a challenge.
I think one thing, so we spent hundreds of millions of dollars on genetic association studies to look at gene associations with hundreds of different diseases. And I'm stealing this quote from somebody, and I can't remember who, but the first genetic association study we should have ever run was on compliance and adherence, right? As the phenotype.
Right, yeah.
We should have just started
So
there and
that's
spent all the money on that first,
Yeah, do they
and
take
then
their
gone to the
meds?
diseases.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a terrific. I wanted to wrap up this panel with one final question for each one of you. Rapid round here. We have 1 minute, literally. If you had one thing or one policy that you want to see, let's look at the magic 8 ball. What would it be to really get this moving? Let's start with you, Andy.
Post-market surveillance for approval of medical products, which can be transformational.
Post-market surveillance.
Better process for piloting new technologies from the payers.
Great. Marty?
Create the incentive for people to want to use this information once we get it to them.
Incentives.
Investment in the large-scale data that we need to do this work.
And Joel?
Echo a lot of those, and also say much more relaxed regulations on diagnostics.
Yeah.
Terrific. Well, I think from what we've heard, there have been a lot of amazing conversations here. I think what I'm taking from it is that we really need to be level-headed about big data, about what it can, and more importantly, about what it cannot do. And we need to be paying attention as to not just who owns it, but again, going back to your term, who possesses it and what they do with it, because that's really kind of the next frontier for medical research and for healthcare delivery. So thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks. Big round of applause for the panelists.
Hey, Christoph,